Welcome again, everyone. Good morning and good afternoon, depending on where you're joining us from. We're going to give it a minute for a few more people to join us and we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Going to give it a couple of minutes for some people to join and also for everyone to have their audio set up. Good morning, Anu. All right, a couple of more minutes. We'll start at 9:04. A couple of minutes. Good morning. I know folks are joining us for different locations. Is it a morning where you are or evening, afternoon? Share in the chat where you're joining us from. Good afternoon, Katharina. Where are you joining us from? Illinois, cool. You're joining us from UK, wonderful. Thank you. Yes, we have some, wow, we have a few people from the UK. That's wonderful. From Ethiopia, Bloomington, Illinois. Perfect. All right, so welcome everyone. I know there's few people joining, but we'll get started and we'll have them follow up with us. Welcome, Mariama from Virginia. Everyone, my name is Najat Abdurrahman, and I'm the founder at N-BAC, and I'm very pleased to host today's workshop. N-BAC is a business advisory and consulting firm that focuses on leadership development, and our core belief is that change and transformation really starts with great leadership. And we serve leaders in helping them transform the way they lead themselves, the way they lead their team, the way they lead their organization for sustainable impact and results. And today's session is such a treat. It's the foundational knowledge that leaders need to continue to develop as a leader. As you all know, leadership is a journey that never ends. It's always a process of learning and unlearning and learning and unlearning. And so we just wanted to get started with this foundational knowledge, and very excited to have Dana Richard here with us. You all might have already read his bio in the introduction that we had in the event, but he brings wealth of experience and knowledge to this topic, and I'll hand it to Dana momentarily. But just a couple of housekeeping items. I will be sharing with you a document in the chat, so please feel free to open that and follow along with him. And also, my only ask is please keep yourselves on video. We want it to be engaging, but mute yourself if you're not talking so we can minimize disruptions. So with that, please help me welcome Dana Richard. Dana, take it over.
Thank you very much, Najat. Can you all hear me? Can anybody hear me? Okay.
Yes.
We always start with that because technology is our friend, except when it isn't. And I'm going to kind of lead this off with, we are trying something new today. So you're sort of guinea pigs. And what we're doing is we're building a series of workshops, and we're working on the presentation aspect of that. And so what you see is I am here, I have a lectern, I have a monitor behind me, we have screen share. And the idea here is that rather than being part of the Brady Bunch squares, I can move around a little and maybe bring some energy to this, because we're going to be here a little while together. And it's good, basically, if we can kind of keep ourselves engaged. So one of the ways I'm going to do that is to move around. But that also means that something might go wrong. Don't worry about it. If something stops working, and Jot and I have a plan, we have backups, we have things we can do. The thing that's most likely to happen is that the monitor may freeze. If you're looking at the presentation on your screen from the screen share, that does not matter because it will run independent of that. That's just one of those little notes there as we proceed. Also, this is going to be audience participation. I'm going to ask questions. I'm going to ask people to read things. And just feel free to jump right in there. You know, it's okay if maybe 2 or 3 of you start at the same time, you'll sort it out. But what we want to avoid is a situation where I say, okay, can somebody read this for me? And then a minute later, we're still waiting for somebody to do that because everybody's kind of scared to just jump in. So feel free to jump in. All we're going to do is ask you to read something. Well, that's the first thing we're going to ask you to do. That's the easy one. A little bit later, we're going to have a couple of breakout sessions. And when we get to these breakout sessions, we're going to need you to really be willing to participate. And another thing, I'll just share an observation about breakout sessions I've been to. You are coming from different places, and you're probably going to want to visit. You'll get to know each other, kind of learn a little bit about where everybody's from and your background. That's really great. Just don't do it in the breakout session. Please stay focused on the questions. We're only going to give you 5 minutes, and then you report back out. Have you ever been in a situation where your group leader has to report out what the group did, and you realize that you never ever actually discussed the question the group was supposed to discuss? Yeah, well, we don't want to do that today. So that'll be one of those things that will come up. So let's jump into this. First off, the background about why we're going to talk about this the way we're talking about it. As you probably saw from some of the introductory material, okay, we may have hit our first snag already. There we go. One of the first things we're going to be talking about is leadership theory. Well, why leadership theory? The reason for leadership theory is that it's really foundational to all the leadership development that you'll encounter. If you go to a workshop, if you go to a presentation, if you attend a class, if you read a book, there is a theory underneath that somewhere. Now, sometimes the author may not be fully aware of it. Sometimes they may not be using it properly. We'll see some of that. But there's a theory underneath there. And if you understand what those theories are and how they relate to leadership style, which we'll discuss, a personal leadership philosophy, which we'll also discuss, then you can actually start to develop your own leadership philosophy, and you can help yourself a lot in how you develop yourself by where you fit in the organizations you anticipate leading in, and how you lead, and how you develop yourself as a leader. And I say it's foundational, and it really is. Unfortunately, it's not something that a lot of aspirational leaders learn. It's not something that gets taught a lot, unfortunately. And it's changed over time. So this is the reason why continuing education over your life is so vitally important. You'll see that we have theories going back to the 19th century. And they've evolved over time, but we also have leaders that are sort of locked in to a particular era, because that was when they were foundationally learning. That was when they were introduced to leadership. And they haven't maybe moved on with some of the newer theories that would help them as leaders. So you're going to kind of learn about that. So let's move on to what we're going to talk about. We have a premise. We're going to share that in a second. We have a language. And we're going to spend a little time there. This is where you're going to help, by the way, as we introduce this lexicon of what these terms are. Now, you could always perhaps discuss me and say, well, I don't think that's the right definition. And you know what? That's great. Because another thing we want you to do coming out of here is to question, is to ask questions, to assess, to analyze, to evaluate resources and say, do I think this is right? Or if it's right or wrong, maybe it's not the right answer. Does it apply to me in my journey? So we want you to learn to question. Then we're going to talk a lot about theory and so on. You see what we're doing up there. So let's move into this. This is our underlying premise. 3 slides. This is the first one. I need somebody to read this. Unmute and read. Go now. Anybody? I can't hear you.
I'll go.
Go for it.
Underlying premise. There is no one single universal best style of leadership or set of leadership characteristics that can be effectively applied to all people, organizations, and situations.
This is a very important concept because sometimes you will see things presented as the silver bullet of leadership that will help you do everything everywhere. It does not exist because we're people and we're leading people and we're leading organizations in a complex world. There's no one solution. The next one. Anybody?
Let me go.
Go ahead.
But there is a best leadership style and set of leadership characteristics for you and your organization and situation.
If you do not walk away from this session with any other thought, grab that one. And finally,
your leadership development journey is about you learning what those are and mastering them.
and that's what you're here to accomplish. For some of you, this may be a beginning. For some of you, you're in a journey that's already in progress and you're trying to enrich it. Those are both great. So now we're going to talk about each of these in little detail. This is still audience participation. We have a number of definitions we're going to look at. And I'm going to ask you to, as we get to them, for somebody to say what each of them is. First off, this is our definition of a leadership theory. Somebody want to read that one for us. I know somebody's got a mic on, I can hear. Go ahead,
I can read
please.
it.
Go ahead,
Leadership
please.
theory. Leadership theory is an assumption about distinguishing characteristics of a particular kind of leader. Theories focus on determining specific qualities, such as skill levels that separate a leader from a follower.
That's our working definition of what a theory is. Notice that this is not a theory in the sense of a nuclear physics theory. This is not theoretical. This is theory as in a body of knowledge. Next. Again, anybody?
Leadership style is a leader's method of providing direction, implementing plans, and motivating people.
We will talk about leadership style today, but not in detail. However, it's a very, very important thing for you as an individual to learn about yourself. And so as you go through your leadership journey, you will want to find assessments that will help you identify your style or styles. And you're going to see in the theory where this actually starts to come into play, where it first started to be talked about. Next.
Leadership philosophy is a structured approach to leading others. Leaders often write philosophies as guiding statements for reference while leading a team.
Now, some of these I would ask somebody to raise your hands if you're familiar with some of these or you've seen them in your workplace, except that I can't see any of you, so it will not help me. This, however, is our end game. One of the things we will start doing today is you will start constructing your own personal leadership philosophy. Now, this workshop is part one of a 5-workshop series that can either be done as a series or all in one day session. We're working towards that. And the goal of that whole series is at the end of that, you will have a personal leadership philosophy and a personal leadership development plan. So we'll talk more about some of the follow-ons later, but start thinking in terms of what philosophy yourself might have as we go through some of these things. Next. So I'm going to jump in there.
Leadership skills are the skills necessary to organize people around a common goal. This involves developing a plan, inspiring people to believe in that plan, and then seeing through its execution.
Important note here. Remember I said that there's no one set of skills that applies everywhere? That's a true statement. However, there are sets of skills that in leadership and other aspects of being an organization that you can identify within an industry, within a field of endeavor, or within a particular organization that can be identified and in many cases also taught. Next.
Leadership competencies are leadership behaviors and skills that can contribute to superior performance. By focusing on competency-based leadership, companies and organizations will be able to better identify their next generation of leaders.
This is also critically important, but we're not actually going to talk about it today. There actually is a whole nother workshop that will deal with this more in detail. But keep it in mind. And I was actually building a leadership development program for a federal agency once, where we actually went through and we did exactly this. We identified what competencies do the leaders in this organization need to have to be effective. And then we built a training program around that. And this actually is our last one. Then you get to take a break for a little while. That was somebody we haven't heard from yet.
Leadership characteristics are features or qualities that identify someone as a leader.
Okay. This is an interesting one, because if you do an internet search on leadership characteristics, as I did, it will not turn up a definition. What it will turn up are several lists of characteristics that people have identified as being important for a leader. And again, you can do that within an organization, a vocation, or an industry, but you can't really there's not one that applies across all leaders everywhere. So I basically made up my own definition. It's just a definition of characteristics from the dictionary as applied to leadership. But you will hear about it a lot. You will see a lot of lists and a lot of discussion on characteristics of leaders. In fact, the organization I come from educationally, the Toastmasters International, has a whole presentation that's entitled Characteristics of a Leader. But that presentation really identifies characteristics that are relevant within that particular organization primarily. Okay, I'm not going to read it again. This is just to remind you what our definition is as we move here. This is the timeline we're going to look at. Theory goes back quite a ways. It's been around for a while. People have been wanting to identify why leaders emerge, why they are the way they are. And there's been a lot of evolution in thought over leadership through time. So it goes all the way back to 1840, and then we're still evolving today. So let's start with this one. The great man theory was developed by Thomas Carlyle back in 1840. Now, he was a Scottish essayist, historian, excuse me, and philosopher. And he actually identified this as 6 fields of human endeavor. Now, what's important in his background is that this was originally developed as a study of history. It was created, or he developed it as a way of explaining why history unfolded the way it did. And the great man concept was that these really great leaders would emerge on the scene when they were needed. So your Napoleons, your Julius Caesars, your Alexanders, when the moment was right, these people who just inherently had these abilities would arrive on the scene, and they would accomplish these amazing things. Now, it was the mid-19th century, so it did come out of the UK, so it is very Western-centric, and it is very male-centric. And as it began to be applied to leadership, it really went towards the military figures, not in the field of endeavor. So you don't see artists on here, you don't really see politicians being talked about, you don't see anybody in science being talked about, nor were they even included somebody like perhaps Joan of Arc or Eleanor of Aquitaine or Saladin as being great leaders, even though they would have been known at that time. It evolved over time. And what they evolved into is an idea, well, what is it about these leaders that makes them great? Can we identify traits that these people have that perhaps we could look for in people, and we can move them into these positions? Now, the premise here is that leaders were really born of the great man, but I thought was, well, maybe they can be creative. Perhaps they can learn how to be leaders. Perhaps they have inherited abilities, or they can somehow pick them up if you can identify what those traits were. Now, by 1950, now this started about the 1930s. In 1950, the theorists have pretty well concluded there was no one set of traits that you could identify across all leaders. And I can attest to that personally. In that same leadership development program I talked about creating earlier, I was on a board that created that. We actually tried to do that. And if I'd remembered my own theory, I could actually save us a lot of trouble. We actually did the literature review, looked at a lot of resources. After looking at it, I actually stopped after 10 different references. Why? Because after the first 10, I could not identify one single trait that every one of them identified as being essential to leadership. That wasn't going to get better going out to 20, 30, or 100. So the conclusion of the 1950s that there's no one trait is still valid. Now, it's not to say that you can't identify traits. You actually can within smaller groups. And companies do actually use psychometrics. It's a science of identifying particular attributes and aptitudes that people can have within a certain line of work or certain job. So it's not totally, it doesn't apply. It's just you can't apply it across all leaders as a universal set of traits. That actually doesn't exist. So we move on. Then we move to, well, maybe it's not traits. Maybe it's not particular characteristics that leader has. Maybe it's behaviors that they learn somehow and then apply. This is moving now more into the idea that not only can leaders be made, but largely they are. Now, there are people that are born with the inherent ability to lead. There are people with leadership talent, just as there are people with talent in the arts, with talent in athletics, with talent in pretty much any other field of endeavor. There are people that have a natural talent for leadership. So some are born, but mostly we're going to create them. We're going to make them. We're going to help people develop these skills. So here we're looking at, well, what behaviors do we teach them? And this is just an example here. This is not say that this is, it covers every kind of behavior theory out there. It doesn't, it's just an illustration. But you do see this as the basis for a lot of our training programs today. Now, what's more important is that the identification of behaviors led to the development of leadership styles. So you're talking now, we still talk about leadership styles. We still help people identify those and develop those. And that idea of style is a theory that has been around since the 1950s. So we're actually dealing with a thought or a concept that's been around for about 70 years now. And although it has evolved and we may have become more refined in how we assess it, it's still there. It's something we're still using. So these theories don't necessarily go away. They more like evolve and get integrated into new information as the science evolves, which is why I think it's very important to understand them all, because they don't actually go away. Now we move on. By the 1960s. Now, something I haven't talked about here, and if we were going to do more than just an introduction, and that's all this is, if we were ready to do this in depth, we would talk a lot more about some of the other things that are happening. Like in the 1960s, let's think of all the things that have happened between 1840 and 1960 that's influenced this. Well, you've had several wars, you've had a couple of depressions, you've had a couple of pandemics, you've had a lot of cultural upheaval and shift, you've had technological upheaval and shift. Actually sounds kind of like now, doesn't it? So a lot of things have affected these. Yeah, by the 1960s, we get into this idea that leadership is a little bit more complex than just looking at the behavior of the leader, that we actually need to take the follower into account. And not only do we need to take the follower into account, but we also have to look at the situations in which leadership is happening. This actually ended up leading to two different directions. This, again, is just an illustration, but if for a situational leader, this idea of delegating, participating, telling, or selling is very important, because a situational leader will move between them. But let's talk about this first. Situational leadership is a situation in which the leader can adapt themselves to the situation. In other words, they have probably multiple styles that they are comfortable in and competent in. And as the situation shifts in the organization, or as they themselves move around, they can adapt to what that situation is. I actually have considered myself to be a situational leader, and part of that is my background was the U.S. Air Force, where I was receiving training and education that was geared towards helping me become one of those, because that was the type of leader that we needed. Now, this is not a style, it's a theory of an application of how we use leadership. Now, adaptive leadership is also very important. In this one, the leader has a very specific defined style that they are very, very good at. But that style will only apply in a certain finite set of situations, environments, and organizations. And if you move them out of that, they tend to be ineffective. Large corporations have and do identify leaders with specific leadership skill sets for the situations that they're facing. This is not an uncommon practice. What it means for you is that if you're doing your assessments and you learn you have a very specific style that is yours, you can develop just that one style, but be aware that you will always have to be moving to situations where that style applies. Now, if your assessment says that you have the ability to develop and use multiple styles, then you become a situational leader and you can move between those. Neither one of those is better than the other. They are different. They both have their pros and cons. So let's move on. 1990s. World strangely continued to get complex. That didn't stop. And leadership had to support that. We had to have leaders that recognized what was going on. We had to have them recognize that the world was in a state of rapid change, that we had really racing technological innovation and this increasing globalization, all of which affected how leaders lead and affected how we train and educate our leaders. And so the focus now shifted to those interactions between the leader, the followers, the situation, and the entire system they're operating within. So we see what's happening here is that these other theories have not gone away. They're still underlying some of our training and education, but we're starting to recognize and bring in the sense of the complexity that these leaders are operating in. I discovered that. Oh, actually, let's back up. One important note here. Previously, all these theories we talked about were really a leader with a downward directed kind of approach. There's a definite line between the leader and the follower. This is where we really start to shift into seeing the followers being included as more of the leadership dynamic. So we get to the new leadership era, then 1990s, a little bit later in the 90s, and we see a couple more terms come up here. The first one is transformational leadership. Again, this is not a theory. Now, I was actually presented to me as a theory when I started learning about this, and when I looked at the literature, they say 1990s. I was actually introduced to this back in the late 80s. And so I think it goes back a little further than that. It just didn't have a label or name or wasn't really integrated yet. But transformational is also called relationship theory, because this is a situation, probably a very dynamic situation with an organization where we are trying to transform the organization, transform people, transform the environment. And so that's why it's called transformational. It's really good in situations, organizations that either have to be revitalized, perhaps it's a company that is trying to bring itself back, perhaps it's a new startup. One of these situations where there's just a lot going on, a lot of change, and so it needs to change the direction it's going, and it needs to be able to very dynamically respond to those changes. Now, transactional leadership obviously goes back a lot further. This is what you might think of as classic management. It is, in fact, sometimes called management theory. And this idea of a transaction is a give or take. It's really a contract between the leader and the follower. And the leader tends to use rewards for people for good performance, for meeting goals, punishments of some type when they don't. Critically, this rests upon the agreement on the part of the followers that the transaction is fair and equitable. So while the transaction is very downward directed in many ways, you do have this collaborative effect of the fact that the follower has to be taken into account because they are part of it. And if they don't buy into it, then it doesn't work. It does have situations where it is extremely effective. Older organizations that are more stable, you find this sometimes perhaps in regulatory types of situations. You'll see this in situations where they are very policy driven. So it actually has a place where it's very effective. There are places where you don't want a lot of change, where you're, in fact, where creating a dynamic change environment would in fact be detrimental. So we look at some of these people. Well, we have like Steve Jobs, Nelson Mandela are very much transformational leaders. Vince Lombardi, General Norman Schwarzkopf, very much transactional leaders. Now, Bill Gates is actually both. So that kind of dispels the idea that you're one or the other. You can be both, and you can adapt as the situation requires. In the 2000s, we really started getting the idea of leadership as being a collaborative process, not just the leader, but the leader and the follower and the leader as an organization as a whole. And this has led us to organizations they're now more dependent on that this process is distributed throughout the entire organization. And so what you see as individuals are servant leaders, which we haven't talked about yet, but servant leaders, such as Starbucks former CEO Howard Schultz and YouTube CEO Susan Wojcicki. But you also see companies that have done this as a philosophy. And McDonald's and Deloitte are both considered to have inclusive leadership cultures where the employee is part of the leadership process. What can we say about complexity leadership theory other than that it's complex? Complexity leadership theory is just a way of trying to apply complexity theory, which is a way of dealing with the world we're in, to leadership. I'm not going to say a lot about it, but it's one of those things, though, that it is going to become more and more relevant as the world and leadership becomes more and more complex. There are a lot of factors that are going to change over time that is going to make this more and more relevant. So I think we're going to see a lot more on this. The 5 levels of leadership. actually originated by John Maxwell back in 1993. Here again, we could do entire talks on the 5 levels of leadership. I have done entire talks on the 5 levels of leadership. But what we're talking about here, I'm going to skip number 4, go straight to number 5, which is something that we aspire to, where we are known throughout the entire industry as being transformational people that people will want to follow us because of who we are and what we're known to be able to do. Now, in the 2000s, Jim calls in his book, Good to Great, actually took this in not a new direction, but more adding more depth to it. And what he came up with is that Good to Great was about corporations that had stood the test of time, that had consistently performed well, were very successful, and were pillars and examples that other companies could follow. His point, which is where it's very important, was where these two connect, was that every one of those companies that went from good to great had a level 5 leader at the point of transformation. Okay, folks, it's still in the morning. I've only had 1 cup of coffee. So we'll see get through the rest of this without too many more of my verbal slips there. But the idea is that while they're not the same, identical, they do actually relate to each other, both of which are worth learning more about. This is kind of where we're at now, one of the most recent ones. And this is one that I'm really working on, strength-based leadership. Now, when I started learning leadership back in the 80s and 90s, the philosophy was you identified weaknesses, and then you went to a lot of effort to try and undo those weaknesses, to try and turn them into strengths and learn ways to be more balanced as a leader, not have weaknesses. That really was always a losing proposition. And so what you had then is Tim Rath and Barry Conchi in 2008 came with the concept of strength-based leadership. And the idea here is that no leader can be strong in every area required. But what leaders can do is identify their own strengths and develop them. They can identify the strengths of their followers and develop those strengths. And they can identify the weaknesses in their organization and the gaps. And then they can hire people to fill those gaps with those strengths. It actually is very much in the leader's interest to do this, because when people know their strengths, they know where they fit and how they can best contribute to the company. It also frees up the executive's time by knowing which employees they can delegate certain tasks to. If you know who's strong in what area, it's pretty simple. The task requires that strength, you send it to that employee. And it minimizes leadership mistakes at the organization. Now, if we're going to whiteboard this will be the conclusions we come up with. I'm going to move very quickly here because we're about half an hour and we want to get to our first activity, which is, these are questions to think about. Now, you might talk about them in your groups, but this is what we're going to talk about. So, no doubt, I think we're ready for that now, which is good because I'm dehydrated.
Sure. So what I'll do is if you can just take a moment to look at the questions that we have here. And then if you can go back to that previous slide.
Mm-hmm.
Just to read, it's a reflection question. You can discuss that in the breakout room, but think of a leader you had a difference of opinions with. Could that have been because of differing theoretical underpinnings? And at the same time, think of a leader you admire, and can you tell what leadership theory or theories their leadership is based on? So this is something to reflect on. You can discuss that in the breakout room.
Yeah.
And then Dana, if you can go to the next slide.
Yeah.
And then for this one, you're basically going to be discussing how have you seen leadership theory affect how leaders lead. You can also discuss about your own leadership development journey.
Yeah.
In that, how does leadership theory impact your personal leadership development? And so what I'll be doing is I'm going to send you to a breakout room, and it's randomly going to assign you to a breakout room. You're going to get a pop-up. Just go to that room. It's going to be about 3 people per room. And then we have 5 minutes, and it will close after 5 minutes. All right.
Keep in mind that you're not expected to be experts on theory. This is just an introduction, but it's food for thought. Get you moving.
Yeah.
And the job probably best if I stay here is we don't know what will happen if I try and move.
All right. I'm opening all the rooms, so you should have received a notification. Welcome back, everyone. I think pretty much have everyone back, Dana.
Okay. I may have actually lost my monitor here, so we'll see. I actually may need to be for you to bring the slides up now.
Sure, I can do that.
Otherwise, I could fix this, but it's going to take some time. So
I can share.
Mhm. Okay. So I'm going to switch my view over here myself. So I'll just. I'm actually going to shut the. I'm going to shut a couple things off here just to save some time and. And I'm going to shut it down on my end. Okay. So this should be yours. Great. So I will just work off of that now. Okay. So, Najat, do you want to handle the discussion here?
All right. And so, Dana, do you want me to share the slides or you're good?
I'm watching yours now, so I shut mine off.
Oh, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and share. Just bear with me one moment.
Yeah.
All right. So does anyone want to share? Just we'll give a chance to just one or two people, I believe, for.
Yeah. Yeah. Back up there. There. Okay.
There you go.
There we go.
All right. Who would love to go and discuss just a couple of a minute or so, just what you discussed in the breakout room? Anyone wants to share?
I suggested that a change in leadership corresponded to a historical change in itself. So if in the 1960s, there was a wish for more equality between sexes, more equality between races, it corresponded, the change in leadership was indeed a wish to have a leader that gets closer to the followers. So there is the correlation between historical periods and the changing concepts like leadership.
Yeah.
That's one of my ideas.
John, I'm going to interject a quick question here for the group. And based on that, because I think that's a very good comment, I'm going to ask the group, have you had leaders you work for, people you work for, that as you look at these things we talked about, you realize that although the leadership theory moved on and how we teach leadership moved on, how we apply leadership has moved on, they themselves have not moved on. And they're still operating in what is perhaps an outdated mindset or mode. Has anybody seen that?
I did.
This was exactly the comment I made and the discussion in our room, that most of the leadership styles I've experienced are definitely 1960s based, hierarchical, top-down, authoritative. And the other ones sound good in principle, and probably they may attempt it in one session in a closed setting, but that is not their default setting.
Exactly. And that's why it is, when I began this, I'm going to repeat something I said at the very beginning. This is why it is so important to you as you develop as a leader to keep up. Now, if I had stopped learning about leadership back in the 1980s, then I would not be applying anything about strength-based leadership. I would not have given any consideration to the 5 levels of leadership. I actually would have ignored a lot of the situational leadership that's so important to me now. So this is why this is a continuing learning, lifelong learning process, because these things do change. Our understanding changes. The tools we have available change. But as you have both identified, not everybody in a leadership position does that. And so we do find a lot of misapplied or outdated modes. So Najat, back to you. Okay, let's talk a little bit about leadership style. And this is going to be a very little bit, because this is a whole nother presentation itself. I want you to see the connection here. Okay, Najat, next slide, please. Okay. This chart is mostly a random collection of lists of leadership styles that have been identified. Now, the first column to the left is from Toastmasters International, their Pathways Education Program. I use that because I developed this for a Toastmasters audience, and this organization Najat and I are both a part of and believe very strongly in. If you guys are not members yet, we can help you learn how to do that. And so that's my baseline. Now, these others are all kind of randomly selected. The first thought here from this slide is that, as you can see, there is no one common list of leadership styles. Now we could go through, and if we actually combined a lot of these that were really different, we'd probably come up with about 12 different identifiable styles that we could identify characteristics for. But usually about 8's where you land. Now next slide, please, Najat. And keep in mind this came out of the 1940s and 1950s. And this is a very important point. Okay, whoop, by the way. We lost our. Did we?
Do you see it now, Dana?
I don't. No, I see the lead-in slide, but I don't see the chart.
Oh, the chart. Okay, here.
Do we have the other chart with the red on it?
Oh, here, yes.
There we go. Perfect. Now, the ones I've highlighted in red, each one of these organizations has presented this as being a leadership style, but they are not. They are either theories or philosophies. Servant leadership is a philosophy, for instance, which we haven't really talked about. And as we talked about transactional, transformational leadership as being theories, we talked about situational leadership as being a theory. But sometimes you will see in the writings where they present these as styles, and it's really confusing because these are all non-dependent on styles. And if we can go to our next slide, your style has a lot of things that create it. Now, some of these you have control over, some of these you do not. Your basic personality, you may not have a lot of control over. Your cultural experience, you may not have a lot of control over. You grew up where you grew up. In my case, that was in the US Midwest, but whatever that's worth. You can control your education and training. You have some control of your life and work experience by where you've chosen to work and where you've moved. Some of these things, the environment may a little less, but this whole combination leads you towards what your leadership style is going to be. So let's move to, okay. I think we lost a slide here. That's okay. No, it'll come up in a second. Yeah, let's move on then. Yeah, let's move on. There it is. No, this is the one I want. The next slide. It's always a little different when you're the backseat driver because you don't actually hold the steering wheel. This is your relationship. Situational leadership is a philosophy. It's how you apply leadership. And what it really is recognizing that you're going to meet the needs of the followers primarily. Surprisingly, the US military is a servant leadership philosophy because even though it's a very bureaucratic organization, it's a very command and control directed organizations, they still believe very strongly in taking care of the troops first. So it's actually a servant leadership style. You see that in a lot. We talked about 2 examples earlier. Then adaptive and situational are theories, but the thing about these 3, there is no one style that works for them. Any number of styles can work inside those. That's why they're independent. And I have some examples there, which if you probably had a chance to read right now, it talks a little bit about those. You can see them right here, how their styles, transactional leaders, transformational leaders, we've had charismatic leaders, and these all have different styles. But those styles are independent of being transformational or transactional. And it's kind of a subtle concept, but it's pretty important because we have to understand that your leadership style does not define necessarily whether you're transactional or transformational, but the situation you're leading in might. And you can be a servant leadership in any kind of a situation, regardless of style. So there's a lot of subtlety in there, and it's kind of important to get our heads around that complexity. But now let's move to leadership philosophy, because this is ultimately where we want to go and helping you develop that. And we had our definition there, and they have a lot of different things that are part of that. And this next slide here will show that. And what you see here is that, like your leadership style, your leadership philosophy has a lot of different things that make it up. What you understand of theory is going to make it up. What the theory that you believe is most relevant is going to make this up. Your values and guiding principles, which will vary across cultures. What you believe are desirable leadership traits and characteristics, those are all going to affect how you design your leadership philosophy and how you try and carry it out. And I was in the graduate course where we did this. So one of the things we're going to do now is you're going to be able to start doing this. And there should be a worksheet in the chat that will get you started. You're not going to get your whole philosophy written today, but you're going to be able to start. Okay, Okay, Najat, I think we're ready to move to that.
All right, so we're gonna send you to a breakout room, but this one is going to be short. In a sense, we're just gonna assign you with one more person, and what you're gonna share some aspects of your leadership philosophy with your group. And of course, you're not gonna do it today, but you have the document in the chat, and we're gonna email it afterwards as well, and you'll have the time to work on this before the next session that we would have. And for now, let's just get you to the breakout room and discuss with the person that you will be with what aspects of your leadership philosophy you're working on, and just opinions. We're going to have 2 minutes. All right. And so the rooms are open.
Okay, John, is everybody? Okay, so I guess that everybody's back.
Yeah. Not everyone, but they're coming back.
They're coming. Okay.
We have for 3 minutes to finalize. I know this is short, but people will have the time to work on this before our next slide. And we'll send the email after this session so everyone has the document.
Yeah. And again, as you'll see at the end of this thing, keep in mind, this is like part 1 of 5 parts, and all 5 parts are designed to help you really build this leadership philosophy and then develop it into a leadership development plan for yourself. Okay, this is we'll leave philosophy behind for a second. I want to talk, this I think is a very important thing. Like I mentioned the breakout session there, so a couple of you have heard this, but not everybody. Back about 1998, 1999, I was in one of my graduate schools, and one of the courses was on the coordination, management, and leadership of the U.S. intelligence community. That's what it was for, doesn't really much matter. But one of the things that we were required to do was a book report. And we had to read this thing, and I read a book, and it was called The Absolutes of Leadership, which is actually not an uncommon title for leadership books. It's absolutes, they're irrefutable laws, all these, they really make this thing very much like this is the word on these things. And I read this book, and I went to our instructor, who was had been a retired Navy captain and been senior executive service, very senior in the U.S. government. I said, I don't think this is right. He said, why don't you put that in your book report? Well, the epiphany was, just because somebody wrote it and published it does not mean it's right. There is no requirement at all that you have to meet to publish a leadership book. Anybody who wants to write a leadership book can write a leadership book. There are over 57,000 titles on Amazon with the word leadership in the title. That doesn't mean that they're bad or that they're wrong. It also does not mean that they are right or that they are good. This is a very personal thing. This is what a lot of this discussion has gotten us to, is that a book that is really great for me may not be great for you. I may read this and I may learn from it, and I may change my entire approach to how I'm leading as a result of that, based on the theory I think is true and my personal philosophy. And I may hand it to you and you read it and say, I don't get it. Well, that just means that book was not right for you in your journey with your theories, theoretical basis, and with your philosophy. So here's some things you can look at to analyze them. Trying to figure out what their purpose is. Now, any book that's written has some kind of a theory underneath it, but the author may not necessarily be aware that they've done that. But you can look and see what the theory is, and it will tell you where they're going and what they're basing this on. Are they writing it for an organization, or are they writing it for individuals? What assumptions have they made, and do you agree with those assumptions? These are just a few questions that you can ask to decide if this book is useful. And do read a lot of different books. You can usually pick up something from all of them. But also another thing we didn't talk about on styles is do multiple assessments. It'll expand your knowledge of yourself, and then revisit these things over time, because your philosophy, your perspective changes over time. So that is a little bit on that, and this is a tool you can use. Also, we will have some other workshops. The next one that we'll be doing is specifically on leadership style. Right now, the first trial run of that is going to be the end of May. And then I don't know if we'll offer it here again or not. It kind of depends how it goes, doesn't it, in the shot? But we are doing some places. So
yeah, no,
I think that I'm done.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Dana. I just wanted to share that a lot of people asked if I'm going to be sharing the slides. So we're actually going to be sending a follow-up email. You're going to receive a Word document where you're able to create your own personal leadership philosophy. We're going to share a guided format of what you see here. We are actually going to be sharing this recording as well. So you'll definitely receive that. And I hope you realize that this is the beginning of the journey and definitely not the end. We're going to have 4 more workshops that I hope you'll be able to join us. And if you want to reach out to Dana, here is his contact information, myself as well, but we do have your email addresses and we'll be following up with you soon. A few things that I wanted to mention is just, Dana, thank you for sharing. It's really the underlying thing is there's no one unique leadership style, but as a leader, you're going to have to learn to adapt. And I really like the comment that was made earlier today. Organizations and leaders have to change and adapt to the change in situation, because otherwise we'll be stuck in the back. And something that we always see, the change in leadership, is that you're following a different theory. And so when you come, you might not really understand in how to lead the organization or yourself. So with that, I know we don't have as much time for questions, but we'll definitely be seeing you in future events. And I wanted to thank you all for joining us today.
Thank you too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.
Thank you and have a great one.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.
A good one.